shaven haircut. 4,000 naira! Hello friends, Roussel. Just a short back and sides, please. So the story in the engine. Could it be that the best episode of this run of Doctor Who is also its most problematic? Well, in this video, I say yes. So let's get into it. A fascinating episode of Doctor Who. Colourful, culturally interesting. A departure from what we normally get to see. Tintin went to the Congo. The Doctor goes to Lagos in Nigeria to visit his favourite barber shop. Who knew he had a favourite barber shop? Certainly you wouldn't know to watch the Tom Baker era of Doctor Who, would you? But this was no ordinary episode of Doctor Who. Oh no, this was written not by the usual hacks that they get on this show, but none other by, check notes, Inua Ellams, MBE no less, he's a Nigerian poet, and you don't need to talk to me about his work, because of course, as you can see from the shelves behind me, I'm absolutely stacked with it. For me, it's Wordsworth, it's Tennyson, and it's Ellams. I'm kidding, I don't read Tennyson. So they brought him in, this black Nigerian gentleman, first ever to write for Doctor Who. So a significant landmark. He just got in just before the end. And naturally, he writes about what he knows, his home country in its oral storytelling tradition, and it's very interesting because it gives us something to chew on. Something that we don't normally get on this show, namely ideas, and a chance to interrogate those ideas and maybe push back a little bit, if that's okay. Because I was interested by this episode, I was never less than interested. Not just because the Doctor, was in Nigeria, which was weird and doesn't normally go there, and we haven't seen him go there before. He doesn't typically venture far beyond England's green and pleasant land and affiliated countries. And yes, this was a British story, in as much that it was a colonial story, wasn't it? He went to one of the former colonies to divest it of its ignorance. Nothing more British than that. Or racist, but, this wasn't about that. This wasn't about, This was about celebrating the fantasy life of our Nigerian friends, its oral traditions, its myths, its religion. You might think that's problematic in and of itself, and if you do think that, congratulations, because I'll be coming back to that very shortly. Takes a sip of tea nervously. Contemplates the backlash. So, there's two things going on in this episode. Let's talk about them, shall we? And no, I don't mean the Doctor's proclamation that 2019 was a great year. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. You decide. Particularly if you're in the wine community, please get in touch about that. No. I was more interested in the identity politics, because the Doctor's been black for a little while now, but this was the first time I felt, we've had little allusions to him feeling awkward in certain milieus, if you like, because he's experienced racial prejudice. We had the episode last season with the racist girl, the dot on the bubble. She refused to be saved by a black man. This year, the Doctor went to Miami in the 50s and he experienced some low-level racial prejudice. He went to a segregated diner. But he's never really talked up his black credentials, has he? He's never really talked up the fact that he's black and that he's developed a black consciousness. Now, I always thought this was for the very, very good reason that the Doctor is above all of that nonsense. You see, there is a way of looking at Doctor Who where you say the Doctor is Gallifreyan, he's an evolved alien, as he says here in this episode, which was the right thing to say, he is that. And therefore he is external to all of the things that constitute a racial consciousness in the human condition. What are they? We're talking about politics, the economy, community, the judiciary, the culture at large. He's not part of any of those things, is he? He's autonomous. He is a culture of one these days. And he travels around on his own, with the occasional human as a pet. So the Doctor wouldn't be subject to the same cultural pressures that create a racial consciousness, would he? There's no such thing as racism on Gallifrey. He didn't. Well, maybe there's a caste system on Gallifrey, but that's not linked to skin colour or things of that nature. This is a culture that, prior to its unnecessary destruction, Roussel, was thousands of years ahead of us. Think about this shit. Have adopted something closer to sort of Star Trek's idea of liberal universalism, which we'll come back to. So why would the Doctor have a black consciousness? Black humans, like Mr. Ellams, would have a black consciousness, wouldn't they? Because they're black and they're human and they live in this world, our world. And consequently, they might buy into things like critical race theory, intersectionality, and the idea that we are all the product, unfortunately, of a series of intersecting oppressions. Based on your gender, your race, where in the world you live, etc., etc. It's very persuasive theory, because you can see how these things would combine to produce a whole spectrum, many thousands of gradations of prejudice, which could be felt in different ways depending on where on the web, that lattice of oppression you are. You see what I did there? It resembles the web in this episode, the nexus, the World Wide Web thing. A literal manifestation of intersecting oppression. I'm not persuaded by this, because I just don't think the Doctor would be subject to that sort of thing. You may say, well, he travels around a lot, maybe he's empathised, he's identified with black humans to the extent that he feels these things internally. Well, in that case, he's a tourist, isn't he? Because he hasn't really experienced it himself. Not really, not the same way that human beings have experienced it. Because the Doctor is literally black, but he's not culturally black, is he? Because he's not a human being. He's a Time Lord. You see the difference? Because Ncuti Gatwa doesn't. And nor does he see the difference, for example, between our perspective and what would be the Doctor's grander perspective of culture, of life, of what have you. When he tells his story, he tells Belinda's boring story about looking after an old woman, what looked like footage out of Casualty. But there he said, and I quote him here, "Nothing is more vivid than an ordinary life." But that's not true from his point of view, is it? Because for him, an ordinary life is the Daleks, is the Cybermen, are the Ice Warriors. That is ordinary for him. Not for us, but for him, certainly. So there is a confusion there, isn't there, about his perspective and our perspective. And this has been the problem with Doctor Who for quite a while, hasn't it? That the Doctor has become us, and in turn has become a duller, less interesting, less enigmatic character. Remember those horrible years with Chris and Jodie and all of those people? Jodie Whittaker's Doctor, indistinguishable in her sort of Magaluf holiday rep persona from the people that she picked up and carried around with her. That's not Doctor Who. There's to be a divide between the Doctor and his companion. They are not the same, any more than you are the same as your family dog or cat, or budgerigar, or hamster, or gerbil, or rat, or whatever godforsaken creature you keep. So you would expect a learned playwright, novelist, performer to understand that distinction, if indeed they were a Doctor Who fan. But unfortunately, Mr. Ellams cannot come to this party and fail to impress upon it his own racial consciousness, because that's who he is, but it's not who the Doctor is. And in a version of the Serenity Prayer that you're all familiar with, we have to know the wisdom to be able to tell the difference. So, that was the first problematic part of this episode, this very interesting episode. By the way, the Doctor's black consciousness extended to a little flashback in which we see that the fugitive Doctor, the original Doctor, as established by you, Chris, in The Timeless Child, the most grotesque act of vandalism to ever be perpetrated on television, the worst retcon ever, was again here revisited as a way of sort of looping things round to the beginning, as if to say the Doctor's had a racial consciousness all the time. He hasn't, has he? And I cite Millard the evidence of the 40 intervening seasons of Doctor Who in evidence. Go ahead and watch them. You'd be amazed what you pick up when you watch the show. So the second part of this episode really was about the oral tradition and about living gods. The Doctor found himself in this barber shop had been taken over by this guy, and this guy, it turned out, was a false god. He initially claimed to be Dionysus and Loki and all the others, and we rolled their eyes and, oh God, on another episode in which the Doctor fights the gods. But it wasn't that. He wasn't that person. He was a mere servant of the gods, who was tasked with finding a way to clean up all of the stories that powered these gods, the gods of fiction, if you like, or the gods of storytelling. It's not all fiction, although we do lie when we tell our stories, don't we? And find a way to clean it all up and make it work as a series of myth stories that people could draw strength from, and so on. And the gods in turn would draw strength from these stories. And the Doctor was horrified when he learned that this man's plan was to end all of that, to kill the gods. The ungrateful gods had cast him asunder. He said, you can't do that. You can't kill the gods. It kills humanity, kills the human race. Humans need their myths, they need their legends, they need their gods. Or they're just, frightened little backward creatures in the dark, without any unifying sense of self or or identity, because it's all about identity. Well, that's not true, is it? Do gods have to be living in order for myths to be important to people? You're here because you like Doctor Who, but you don't don't like Doctor Who, but you don't for a second believe Doctor Who is a real thing, do you? You don't believe there really is a Doctor out there, and these stories are adapted from his adventures. It's fiction. You understand that, and you're completely fine with it. Star Wars fans, though they're on their knees begging for it all to be over, as we speak, are invested in that mythology, which is complete fantasy, which is something George Lucas made up. Like all myths, like all stories, like all religions. But the idea that the god, the figurehead, the central power, authority that underpins these stories has to be a living thing, has to be, thought to be alive. It's a highly problematic and backward and regressive idea, isn't it? Because it's suggesting that there is legitimacy to all of the things done in those gods' names, and that's a fascinating idea to come from a writer who is born in Nigeria, for example. Think of the amount of struggle that they've had in Nigeria with religion, the conflict between Islam and Christianity, for example. The amount of people who've died in Nigeria because of religious conflicts. If I said to you, Boko Haram, you'd say Gesundheit. But if you're in Nigeria, you understand there's some issues there, isn't there, around religion, around mythology, around the stories we tell ourselves, and what that can lead to. Bombings, atrocities, murder. Wouldn't we be better off as a species if indeed we put all this to one side, acknowledge that all of these stories are just stories told from generation to generation and reinterpreted, and that in looking for guidance in them, we should look for, if you like, the universal elements, the human elements in those stories, the morals of those stories. What are they trying to tell us about how we should behave and how we should live? But we need to know that they're just stories so that we have the wisdom to evaluate whether or not we should put too much credence in them. We should be able to proportionately weigh up what impact they should have on our lives. Take what you want, get rid of the rest. Yes? Watching this episode, I was troubled by the Doctor's, if you like, jealous guarding of the right of gods to exist. And it's a funny position for him to take, isn't it? Because he's been battling against gods for 2 seasons now. Must be sick to death of encountering God. God, I wish they were just stories. I'd have a lot less to worry about. I don't like this little fantasy twist that Doctor Who has taken, this sort of blurring of theology and science fiction. It's a science fiction show, and it should stick to science fiction, in my view. You bring in these other elements, and it becomes a sort of problematic commentary on the nature of faith and religiosity and spirituality. And these things are not the Doctor's concern. He is an evolved being. Yes? Somebody whose understanding is far beyond ours. And his instinctive reaction to the end of these gods shouldn't be horror. One would imagine it'd be sort of relief. It's like, fuck. Imagine a future in which people don't literally believe in this nonsense. It was, to some extent, a repudiation of the kind of future, or the kind of human race as imagined in Star Trek, for example. Do you remember Star Trek? Star Trek's liberal universalist tradition was about the idea that we'd evolved to a point as a species where we didn't literally believe in God any longer. That we came together based on our common humanity. Yes, we didn't need that crutch any longer, because that crutch had been replaced by a sort of, if you like, second enlightenment, a new understanding about humanity's place in the universe and so on. And that's not fashionable anymore because of things like identity politics, because of things like intersectionality, because of, if you like, the revival of major theisms in the world and their sort of oppressive, controlling nature. All of a sudden, Star Trek's universalism looks naive. But I don't consider it to be naive. I consider it to be a sublime and noble ideal that we should aspire to. And that's why the story in the engine didn't work for me, because it said, fuck you to that idea, and fuck you to the idea of being something other than, your race, your colour. And the Doctor adopted a historic and ethnic background, appropriated that background, when he himself has no part of it. And that's why, as interesting as it was, as colourful as it was, and as welcome, as refreshing as it was, as a different type of Doctor Who episode, for me, it was problematic. And it fell short, conceptually. Because, basically, it was not so much an expression of new ideas, but a reflection of some highly problematic and fashionable present-day ideas. So, a great time capsule for future media studies students to look at, to see how the messages of 2025 were being mediated in popular television, but a problematic piece of Doctor Who, which will age, alas, and maybe not well, but we'll see. Still the best episode of this season by a country mile, mainly because, Roussel, you weren't involved. And when you're not involved, things really perk up. I found it wryly amusing, by the way, that at the end of the episode, the world's greatest library effectively was destroyed, and the curator of said library, bereft, was told by the Doctor, open your own barber shop. Much laughter in the Macclevoid household erupted. Just one thing here. Mrs. Flood, for continuity, did appear in this episode in the Doctor's story. When he was talking about Belinda's experience. She didn't notice Flood, really. It's just a woman that she knew walking into the hospital. So one wondered why it registered in her memory at all, and why the Doctor would register that incidental detail when he was telling the story secondhand. That was weird, wasn't it? Didn't you think so? But not nearly as weird as next week, because next week, oh God, with a sudden crushing inevitability, it's Roussel's dream episode. It's the Eurovision Song Contest in space with Ryland Clark. We go from the profound to the ridiculous in just 1 week. Roussel, you're running out of episodes. Can you really afford to have this shit on? You know, Russell wasn't even sure that the episode was going to be transmitted, apparently, because of scheduling problems. So who knows, maybe we can all pretend it didn't exist. But anyway, that's next week. For now, that's it. The story in the engine. Interesting, but problematic. I'll see you next time. I'm Dr. Macclevoid. It's not my real name. Bye.